Studio then is Sophie Mokoena, our foreign desk editor. Thank you very much for joining us, Sophie. Morning to you. All right, so 3 North African countries in turmoil at the moment: Libya, Algeria, Sudan. There seems to be a bit of a silence from the AU, and one wonders if it's a wait-and-see approach of sorts. Is there any link to the fact that Egypt is the chair of the AU?
Well, of course, Egypt is currently mum, and indeed Egypt is the chair of the AU. President Al-Sisi, no word from him yet, but in terms of the AU, the Commission, the statement was issued last week where the AU Commission reiterated its stance that they would like to see peace in those 3 countries. But many people are asking a question whether what is Egypt doing? They were supposed to call perhaps an urgent meeting for leaders on the continent to try and find a solution, because you have a serious problem in Sudan, you have a serious problem in Algeria, you have a serious problem in Libya. If you have 3 African countries that are experiencing challenges, you would expect that the continental body will act.
But we all watched anxiously as the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, and there was a lot of talk about the second wave of the Arab Spring. Would you say that this indeed is that second wave that many people were sort of anticipating? I mean, I think that the demonstrations have their own characteristics, but at the same time there are many parallels that we're noticing.
Yes, many are saying this is the second Arab Spring, but it's quite different in a sense that as soon as you see these protests and the sitting leader takes a decision to step down, you find the military coming in. And unfortunately, or fortunately in this case, the ordinary citizens of those respective countries are saying, when we ask for change, we don't ask for the same elite to come back in a different name. Therefore, they are really fighting to ensure that whoever becomes the interim leader or the interim structure is not the same people who were part of the previous leader. And in this case, they are saying they don't want to see the military taking over. You know, in Zimbabwe, you know what happened there. When Mugabe was removed, you had Mnangagwa with the assistance of the military coming in. And now you have the former general being a vice president. In fact, the 2 former vice presidents were generals. And secondly, the foreign affairs minister is a former general. And therefore, you still have that setup of a huge influence of the military. Therefore, in these 2 countries, Algeria and in Sudan, the ordinary citizens are saying, we called for change, we want the real change, we don't want a military rule. And we saw yesterday in Sudan where the general who had earlier pronounced himself as the new interim leader stepping down, but again another general taking over. And they are still out there in the streets fighting, sleeping there outside the military compound to ensure that the person who becomes a leader of the interim structure is a civilian. Therefore, it's quite different from what we saw some years ago when we had the first Arab Spring.
You know, we talk about military involvement. One would then expect some word from the UN. I earlier asked you about the AU's involvement, but that brings me then to the UN's involvement in Libya and Sudan. What has been the word there coming from the UN?
The Security Council meeting yesterday, they did look at this issue of Sudan, but clearly there was no outright solution or permanent solution to this crisis. Yeah. And the sad thing is that the Security Council and the United Nations peacekeeping force are currently involved in Libya and also in Sudan. You know, the Darfur question, where South Africa was also involved. And our former President Thabo Mbeki is still involved on the Sudan question, the Darfur conflict. And they were supposed to have had talks earlier this year in January, where they were finalizing the peace process in Darfur. But then the meeting was moved because those who are involved in the conflict in Darfur indicated that because of the current protest in Sudan, they would want to postpone the talks, but supporting those who were out on the street and who were calling for Bashir to vacate office. Therefore, you can see now it's a stalemate, and you find a situation where the peace processes are now taking a back seat. The same with Libya. We know that Africa was involved, the AU was involved through the former president of Tanzania, Jakaya Kikwete. Now you have this serious problem again. And also the Arab League was involved in Libya. But now all those efforts, you can't continue the talks in that country while the situation is so volatile. It's a serious problem. So I don't understand why the African Union doesn't call an urgent meeting.
You know, you talk about former President Thabo Mbeki's involvement there in Sudan. What's your sort of opinion on South Africa and the events that are unfolding and our involvement? Is South Africa correct in maybe sitting back, but is it also in a sense of, one would expect that South Africa being seen as the big brother, I suppose, should be more involved in what's happening? How do you see all of this?
South Africa is the incoming chair of the African Union. In 2020, South Africa will be chairing the African Union. Therefore, you can say indirectly we are deputy chair of the African Union. But for now, I think the talks are behind the scenes. Last week on Sunday, I did ask the Minister of International Relations, Lindwe Sisulu, because my sources told me that there has been a delegation from Libya. They came to South Africa to ask the current president, Dr. Cyril Ramaphosa, to be involved in Libya. And the minister told us at the media briefing that yes, it's true, they did meet a delegation from Libya, but the president is still thinking in terms of whether we should be involved. And other people are saying, perhaps because of our own elections in the country and preparations for elections,
we have
that's
our own
where
problems.
the focus is. But I was also told that we are likely to host the African Union mid-year summit in June, July this year. Therefore, perhaps as soon as we are the host, we will see South Africa getting more involved and also perhaps coming out in public in terms of our position. But the South African foreign policy is clear. We want a peaceful Africa. And therefore, behind the scenes, I'm sure there's a lot of work that is being done. And of course, then you have our former President Thabo Mbeki, who's still involved as part of the high-level panel on Sudan. And the last time I spoke to him, it was in Addis Ababa, first week of February after the AU summit, where he indicated that he would have loved to be back in Sudan to try and finalize the peace process. But the current protest, because remember the protest started in December, has led to a situation where he had to postpone his visit there. But I am sure that behind the scenes there are still talks. And we also have our former ambassador, Ndate Kingsley Mamabulo, who is the envoy for the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who is also involved in the Sudan question. As we speak, he is in Khartoum.
All right, and a lot happening on the continent, the coming days and weeks. I did see a tweet from Ivanka Trump saying that she'll be in Africa. Of course, they think Africa is a country. I'm sure
that was my question this morning. That Africa where?
So I'm going to ask you, what's the itinerary then?
The visit. Where are we supposed to be? But I got a quick response after perhaps 30 minutes. Our correspondent in Addis Ababa, Coletta Wanjowi, indicating that she has just received an invitation from the American Embassy in Addis Ababa, where they have been invited to cover the event. Therefore, she will be visiting Ethiopia on Monday, and also she will visit Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. Therefore, we know. And maybe tomorrow, the announcement by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia that he's launching the cleaning campaign, it's a precursor for the visit of Ivanka Trump.
What can we expect then from the foreign desk with regards to all the coverage? I mean, as I said, a lot happening.
We'll continue to ensure that we cover the continent from African perspective with our bureaus on the continent and our correspondents around the world, particularly looking at the reaction at the UN, because you have all these embassies. You know, you have the whole Africa at the United Nations, also at the UN, at the AU. Will continue to try and get reaction from the AU in terms of what's happening in Libya, in Algeria, in Sudan, but also we are monitoring the situation in the DRC. When are we going to see a fully fledged government? We have the president, but the government, and also we'll try and do a follow-up on Nigeria. When is the inauguration of President Buhari?
All right, Sophie Mokoena, always a pleasure. Many thanks to you. Thank you for that, and looking forward to all that coverage. That was Foreign Desk Editor Sophie Mokoena. All right, let's take a short break. After the break, your sports news.